Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a concept that's, well, absolutely central if you're trying to understand global politics, especially for university students digging into international relations. That's the balance of power.
Right. It's a term you see everywhere. And as Innes Claude Jr. famously said, the issue isn't that it has no meaning, but maybe that it has too many meanings.
Exactly. And that complexity is what we really want to unpack today. We're going to look at the definitions, its nature, the methods used, and, crucially, how relevant it still is for academic study.
And we're basing this discussion on our source material, the pasted text, to keep it focused. So the big challenge first. What is balance of power, theoretically speaking?
Okay, yeah, because, as we said, no single easy answer. The source gives us a few scholarly takes, like Sidney Buffet describes it as just equilibrium, right? To stop any one nation getting too strong and imposing its will.
Right. Fay emphasizes that preventative aspect, stopping hegemony before it starts.
Then you've got George Schwarzenberger. He talks about equilibrium too, but maybe more about stability that comes from things like alliances.
Yeah, his feels a bit more dynamic, less about a fixed, just balance, and more about actively managing those power relationships using tools like alliances.
That's a useful distinction. And Innes Claude offers another angle, seeing it as a sort of decentralized system, where states manage things themselves without a big power overseeing it all.
Claude really highlights the systemic aspect, how order can emerge from the interactions of independent states when there isn't a higher authority.
And then Lord Castlereagh, his definition sounds a lot like Fay's, again, that just equilibrium to prevent anyone becoming dominant.
The fear of dominance, yeah, it really comes through in those earlier conceptualizations.
Definitely. And then there's Hans Morgenthau. His definition seems more straightforward, maybe. An actual state of affairs where power is spread out roughly equally.
Right. Morgenthau focuses more on the observable distribution of capabilities at a particular time. It's almost more empirical sounding.
It's fascinating how they all circle the same idea but emphasize different facets. So, given all these different definitions, what are the core characteristics? What's the essential nature of the balance of power we should keep in mind for, academic analysis?
Palmer and Perkins give us a really useful breakdown here. First, they stress it is an equilibrium, but, and this is key, it's always changing, a just equilibrium or some sort of equilibrium, as they say. It's not static.
That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Power shifts constantly, economics, tech, politics. So it's also temporary and unstable by nature.
Exactly. Any balance you see is probably not going to last long. The same forces that create it eventually disrupt it.
And it doesn't just happen automatically. States have to actively work at it.
Precisely. It requires deliberate policy, strategy, effort. It's not a passive state of being.
Okay, so dynamic, unstable, needs active management. Palmer and Perkins also say it tends to favor the status quo among the big players, but needs dynamic foreign policy. That sounds a little contradictory. How does that work?
It's a subtle point, yeah. The aim is often to preserve the existing power structure among major states, stopping anyone from overturning it. But to preserve it, states need to be flexible, shift alliances, react to rising powers. So the goal is stability, but the method is often very dynamic.
Okay, I see. Maintaining the overall structure requires flexibility within it. Then there's the stark point about war, being both a test and a potential consequence.
Yes. From a realist viewpoint, war can show whether the balance was working or if someone miscalculated. A big war often means the balance broke down.
And as source notes, its main job isn't necessarily peace itself, but stopping hegemony, even if war is needed to restore the balance. That's a tough concept for students sometimes, challenging more idealistic views.
It is. The logic is state survival first. Avoiding domination might mean accepting limited conflict to prevent a worse future under a single, all-powerful state.
The source also mentions the big powers of the main actors here.
Right. It's mostly about their capabilities and how they interact. Smaller states are often more like pieces on the board than players themselves.
And you need multiple states, independent ones, for it to even operate, right? Can't balance with just one or two big players.
Correct. The whole theory assumes a system with several significant actors who can influence each other.
And finally, underpinning all of this is national interest.
Exactly. States play this game, ultimately, to protect themselves, ensure their survival, and advance their own interest in what they see as a competitive world.
Okay, so that paints a complex picture. Dynamic, unstable, actively managed, multiple big players, driven by self-interest, aiming to stop hegemony, maybe even through war. Now, the source talks about a golden age. When was that, and why is it seen that way academically?
That usually refers to the period from 1815 after Napoleon up to 1914 World War I, particularly in Europe.
Okay.
During that time, balance of power was widely seen as like the fundamental rule of the game. The relative lack of huge continent-wide wars for a lot of that century is often credited to the system working, managing rivalries through diplomacy, shifting alliances. The Concert of Europe is the classic example.
But it didn't last. World War I shattered it. What went wrong from a systemic perspective? Why did it collapse?
Several things, really. Alliance systems became too rigid, too locked in. What was meant for security actually made a small conflict likely to blow up into a massive one.
Right, the domino effect.
Exactly. Plus, you had rising nationalism, making states less willing to be flexible and switch partners based purely on strategic need. And then the massive arms race fueled by industrialization, it just created too much tension and suspicion.
And attempts to revive it after World War I didn't really stick, leading eventually to World War II. It seems the whole game had changed.
It really had. The sheer scale and ideology of the world wars, new global players outside Europe, international organizations like the League of Nations, then the UN, it all marked a huge shift away from that 19th century model. The traditional balance of power wasn't the main or maybe even a primary tool for order anymore.
So, underlying this whole theory, what were the basic assumptions? What did thinkers and leaders believe had to be true for this system to function?
Well, the source highlights a few key ones. First, the idea that states are rational actors. They'll protect their vital interests, and they're willing to use any means, including war, to do it. That's core political realism.
A pretty stark view of international life, emphasizing competition and threat.
Yes. Second, it assumes those vital interests are always potentially threatened because there's no global government to guarantee safety, the whole anarchy thing.
Which leads to the security dilemma.
Yeah.
Right. One state's defense looks like another state's threat.
Exactly. Third assumption. You can actually measure and compare state power with reasonable accuracy, so policymakers can make informed choices about who to ally with.
Which we know is incredibly difficult in reality, measuring power.
It is. Tangibles like military kit are one thing, but intangibles like national will, tech edge, diplomatic skill. The theory kind of assumes you can get a good enough estimate, though. Fourth, the balance itself acts as a deterrent. Or if deterrence fails, it helps you defend yourself because power is roughly equal. The idea is, no one wants to start a fight they probably can't win. And finally, the assumption that statesmen do make rational, calculated decisions based on these power factors.
A big assumption, maybe. History shows misperceptions, domestic politics, leaders' personalities often play a huge role, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Now, beyond assumptions, there are also key operating principles or postulates. First, nations have to be ready to switch alliances when needed. The balance matters more than old friendships or ideology.
Very pragmatic, almost cold-blooded view of alliances.
Second, if one state starts getting way too powerful, others will band together against it, maybe even considering a preventive war to stop them. A potential hegemon is the big danger signal.
So it's proactive, watching for power shifts. And third,
if war does happen, the goal isn't to wipe out the enemy state completely, especially a major power. It's to weaken them enough to restore the balance.
right, eliminating a major player could create a vacuum or mess things up even more. The goal is equilibrium.
Exactly. The fundamental rule is too much power gets checked by power.
Okay, so with that theoretical framework laid out, how did states actually do this? What were the practical tools and methods they used to maintain this balance?
Our source lists 7 main methods. First is compensation, basically trading territory or other gains. If one state gets bigger, others might demand something equivalent to keep things relatively even. Think about the partitions of Poland in the 18th century, a grim example.
A kind of tit for tat in power terms. Method 2 is alliances and counter-alliances. Pretty straightforward, this one.
Yeah, military pacts. Grouping together to boost your own side's power or counter a rival group, like the Triple Alliance versus the Triple Entente before World War I, or NATO versus the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Classic examples.
Creating power blocks. Third is intervention and non-intervention.
Right. Sometimes states jump into another country's affairs, maybe even militarily, to tilt the balance. Other times they deliberately stay out, perhaps hoping rivals will weaken each other. Lots of Cold War examples of both the US and Soviets intervening, or sometimes choosing not to.
So getting involved or staying out strategically, always watching the bigger picture. Fourth method, divide and rule.
A classic strategy. Weaken opponents by encouraging splits or conflicts among them or within them. The source mentions historical French policy towards German states, British policy in Europe. And it's still relevant today, even if it looks different.
Exploiting divisions for strategic gain. Fifth is buffer states, or zones.
Yeah. Creating weaker states located between major rivals. They act as a cushion, reduce friction. Think of Belgium historically, or Afghanistan sometimes. Of course, influencing those buffer states often becomes a competition in itself.
Like a geopolitical shock absorber. Sixth is armaments and disarmaments. Seems contradictory.
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? States build up armies to deter rivals, but they also negotiate arms control treaties to stop destabilizing arms races that could make war more likely. It's a constant tension.
Seeking security can sometimes breed insecurity for everyone. Okay, and the final method, the holder of the balance.
Right, the balancer. This is a powerful state, or maybe a group, that tries to stay somewhat aloof from the main rivalries, but is ready and able to jump in and support the weaker side if one power threatens to become dominant. Britain in the 19th century is the textbook example.
The strategic player waiting to tip the scales. And the source notes, we don't really have a clear global balancer now.
That's a key point. The absence of an obvious balancer in the post-Cold War world, especially during unipolarity and now emerging multipolarity, creates more uncertainty, perhaps.
Okay, so a whole toolkit of methods, but is this system actually any good? Is it effective, desirable? The source looks at arguments for and against. Let's start with the pro side. Stability is a big one.
Yes. Proponents argue it provides a kind of stability in an otherwise chaotic world by preventing any one state getting too powerful. Frederick Jenitz's idea that war happens when power gets too concentrated fits here.
And it fits the dynamic nature of international relations, allowing adjustments without constant, huge wars.
That's the argument. It allows for change while discouraging anyone from trying to take over completely. Supporters also say it helps maintain a world of multiple independent states, stopping empires from just swallowing everyone up. And maybe protect smaller states somewhat.
By preventing total domination by the big guys, and the deterrence argument making aggression too costly because others will gang up on you.
Exactly. Making ambitious states think twice. And some point to periods like 1815, 1914 in Europe as proof it can foster relative peace, at least among the major players.
That long peace is often cited, yeah.
Yeah.
But the arguments against it are pretty strong too. First off, it clearly doesn't guarantee peace, does it?
Absolutely not. History is full of wars fought in the name of the balance of power, and smaller states, like Poland, got wiped off the map, despite the system supposedly protecting them.
So the reality doesn't always match the theory. Critics also say focusing just on military power is too narrow. Power changes in other ways, economically, technologically.
Right. It can be a bit static, failing to capture those non-military shifts. And some argue the opposite. Maybe a single dominant benign power could actually keep the peace better than a precarious balance. The post-Cold War U.S. unipolar moment is sometimes debated in this light.
A challenging idea that hegemony isn't always bad for peace. The source also calls the balance of power framework narrow, right? Just focusing on power, ignoring economics, culture, international law.
Yeah, critics say it's too mechanistic, missing the richer tapestry of international life, the shared norms or interdependence that might also foster peace. And the idea that states are equal is a bit of a myth, isn't it? True equilibrium is rare.
And states aren't always free to just ditch alliances for strategic reasons. Ideology, history, domestic politics all interfere.
Definitely. Plus, that problem we mentioned earlier, how do you accurately measure power anyway? Morgenthau himself pointed out how uncertain it is. If you can't measure it reliably, how can you balance it perfectly?
The source even says it's ultimately unreal because of secret capabilities and hidden strengths.
That uncertainty breeds mistrust, potentially making things worse, not better. So the ultimate critique is often that it's just not a good basis for real peace because it accepts war as a tool and doesn't address conflict's root causes. And crucially, many argue it's just lost relevance today.
Which brings us right to that final point. Its role and relevance now, in contemporary international relations, the source lists a lot of reasons for its decline globally.
It does. End of European dominance, truly global politics, different psychological environment, less moral consensus maybe, propaganda, ideology becoming central, fewer superpowers after the Cold War, end of colonialism, no clear balancer, total war becoming thinkable, the UN. It's a long list.
A fundamental transformation of the international system.
Absolutely. The world stage looks very different from the 19th century. However, and this is important, the source also says the principles haven't vanished entirely, especially regionally. Snyder and Wolfers are mentioned saying balance of power politics persists at that regional level.
Okay, so maybe not the global organizing principle anymore, but still very much in play in places like the Middle East or East Asia, South Asia. States are still balancing against powerful neighbors.
Exactly. The logic of checking concentrated power, forming counter-coalitions, it's still highly relevant in many regional contexts. And Palmer and Perkins suggest that as long as we have independent nation-states competing, some form of balance of power politics will likely continue.
That feels right. The basic impulse to prevent others from dominating you probably won't disappear while the nation-state system exists.
So it's not obsolete, but its role has definitely changed. It's more localized, maybe less central to the overall global structure than it once was perceived to be.
Okay, so summing up our deep dive. Balance of power, incredibly complex, multiple meanings, dynamic, unstable, actively managed using various tools like alliances and compensation. Historically crucial, especially in its golden age, but also heavily criticized for not assuring peace and being too narrow. And while its global dominance as a theory or system has faded due to massive changes, its logic persists strongly, particularly in regional power struggles.
That covers it pretty well. It remains absolutely essential for any serious student of international relations to understand, even with all its flaws and transformations.
Definitely. And that leads us to a final thought for all of you, especially those grappling with these ideas in your studies. Given all the problems and criticisms of the balance of power, what other ways might we think about achieving global stability and security in the 21st century? Are concepts like collective security through international organizations, or maybe deepening economic interdependence, or promoting shared democratic values, or strengthening international law, could these offer better, more reliable paths forward than constantly trying to balance power? It's something critical to consider as we navigate the ongoing challenges of power in our world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.